So I am Dr. Abigail Fisher, and this is just a picture of me. And all the illustrations drawn by Eliza Fricker, and all the illustrations are she's drawn, and they're from a book that we've written together. So I just have to acknowledge that because of the copyright. And it's about the EHCP process, and that is 𝘗𝘭𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬𝘬 process as a professional from the inside, and I've worked with local authorities, and now I'm working independently, and I do a series of webinars about the EHCP process. And so through working with Eliza, really, I've got experience of the process, both as her parent experience, going through the process for her own child, and my experience as a professional. And we both found there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of misinformation. And so we're trying to give you information to help you make your own decisions, really. And in this talk particularly, I'm going to go through the kind of particular issues that you encounter when with a child with PANDAS and working with school. And I'm going to start off with a story. And this is Lauren, and her son is called David. And when David was 11, he got ill and his throat got badly infected. When he recovered, he went back to school and he didn't seem to be fully well, but they just put it down to puberty. And he started introducing new rules about cleanliness and hand washing. Mealtime started to become a trial, and he got increasingly irritable with his siblings. His parents went to the GP, who referred them to CAMHS, and they recommended a parenting course. And Lauren felt like they were saying it was their fault. Then David got to secondary school and everyone there was new. So they didn't understand what his parents were saying when they were talking about how he was different and things that what he'd been like before. He was struggling with work he would have been able to do previously, and he was put in the lowest groups when he could have been in the highest set before. Things started to get a bit worse because David got a virus and he started having hallucinations, and it was very scary, but the waiting list for CAMHS was still really long. He stopped going to school and his parents got threatened with court because of the attendance issues. And David read these letters and he got really upset. He started saying he wanted to die because everyone hated him and he was causing lots of problems. The school wouldn't support their request for AOTAS because they said the problem was behaviour and parenting. And his parents were really stuck and they started seeking private help, but they didn't know who to turn to. A psychologist suggested it was anxiety and said he shouldn't be allowed to avoid going to school. Blood tests were done, but nothing really showed up. And a paediatrician said that everyone was a bit anxious after COVID and they needed to help him get back into school. Eventually, through the internet, David's mum came across the PANDAS support groups and found a private consultant who listened and took David's problems seriously. She still has flashbacks to getting letters from the local authority, and his dad was absolutely furious with how they'd been let down and treated by the system. David felt terrible about himself and felt he'd put his family through something awful. It had been really difficult. This isn't anywhere that they ever expected to be. David still isn't back at school and really needs a specialised package, but the local authority is saying they can't help if he isn't in school and they can't assess him at home. So you might recognise some aspects of this family's experience. And what I'm going to try and do today is talk about some of the particular challenges you can face going through the EHCP process when your child has these kind of difficulties. And it's relevant whether you do or don't have a diagnosis. So all the stories and case studies I use are drawn from real experiences, but they are composites. And I'm going to give you a quick whistle-stop tour of EHCPs in the process. Then I'm going to talk about the particular challenges and give some tips to help. And then Tina and I are going to take some questions. So what's special about an EHCP? It's a holistic assessment. So it's a way to get an EP involved if there's no other way to do that. And they will read everything, observe and talk to your child, talk to you and staff, and think about how it's all impacting them in school. And they will be the professional thinking overall, what might help here. And you might hear it referred to as a statutory assessment because the plan is legally binding. So statutory means written in law, and the local authority is obligated to provide what's written in the plan. So that means if it's not being provided, you can take them to court, to a tribunal, you can argue your case. And the local authority is responsible providing what's written in the plan. You don't actually need an EHCP if your child has health or care needs, but their education isn't affected. What it brings is like an additional level of protection and oversight. It brings your child to the attention of professionals outside school, and it can bring annual reviews to think about what's working, annual meetings, what needs to change. Okay. And It is a long process, even at the best of times. I think so. It's always worth keeping on thinking about what's happening on the ground. What can schools do without one? Schools vary a lot in their flexibility and their ability to adapt to individuals. And the experience and training of the staff will affect how well they understand what your child needs. Legally, they have to make reasonable adjustments for a child, but there is no definition of what that is. And they aren't the same. Their expertise and experience varies a lot. And their kind of ability to adapt varies a lot. But if you're in the position where you're working with school and it doesn't seem like things are working, you're trying stuff, but things aren't getting better, you might be at the point of having to make the decision, should we keep trying in school? Should we go ahead with the process? And I think if they aren't putting things in place, you might need to go for an EHCP in order to get your child's needs recognised, in order to get that better understanding if the teachers you don't feel do understand. If they're misunderstanding your child, perhaps they're punishing them for what they see as behaviour, but what are actually brain symptoms. If you know you need a different kind of provision, perhaps something specialist or bespoke like 𝘗𝘢𝘳𝘬𝘪𝘯𝘨 which I mentioned, which is education other than at school. Perhaps if your child is too ill to be at school frequently, or if you really want to get something set up so when there's times when they're not at school, there's still some kind of support there, then you would need a plan for that. And if you want a key adult at school, if you really think they need quite a lot more support who is consistent, then you would need a plan for that. So the process, when it works best, is about trying to agree and articulate a way forward together. It is a journey. It takes like 6 months. It's a 20-week process, even if it all goes to well. And it takes up time and energy for that time. And parents say that it does help to kind of know that. And sometimes people plan when they're going to do it so that their life isn't overwhelmed if they've also got a lot of other things going on to manage. Because like any journey you're going on, one has to prepare, and it takes a lot of time, meetings and staying on top of things in this. This is an outline for you, just a shortened one, a simplified one really, of the process for requesting an assessment through to getting a plan. And these are legally mandated timeframes. So you can see it says week 0, week 6, week 12. So those are all written in the Code of Practice saying, if you request an assessment, the local authority must decide by week 6, and they're meant to have your plan finished, ready for you by week 20. But local authorities at the moment often might not meet these. There are staffing issues and they are struggling, as I'm sure you know. I'm just going to talk briefly about the stages. So preparation is when you are thinking about the evidence that you've got. You might be making sure you've got reports. You might be thinking about the options, what might work. No one kind of sits you down and talks you through the process or says you could try this, or this might be the right place. Sometimes people think that might be the caseworker role, but in reality, I find that they say, we learn about the options from talking to other parents, finding out what's in your local area. It's very locally specific in terms of different settings. And I think parents say to me, it worked best when we were proactive. So trying to do things in advance, thinking about what might be needed, rather than reactive when the plan is issued, for example, and it doesn't say what you want it to say then. Trying to change it at the end of the process is very hard. But if you have a sense of what you want as you're going through, then you're talking to the professionals, they're listening, they're writing reports. That's when you can have most impact. The request stage can sometimes be a bit confusing. You're asking for an assessment to be done. So at this stage, they can say no. It goes to the panel and they decide whether or not to assess your child. But if they do say no, you can go to mediation and you can go to appeal. That is a paper process and it's free to do. And it's very common. Most assessments might get turned down at that stage, and you have to send it to appeal. The assessment happens, and you would get an assessment from educational psychologists who would come and visit. The school will be asked to give information. Even if your child now isn't in school, they will be asked for something. And health will be asked to make a contribution. It's quite common for health just to draw on what they have from the last visit. For example, if you saw your GP a while ago, then they might send in the letter they wrote at that point. They don't necessarily organise an extra appointment as part of this assessment. Then the caseworker writes a draft plan in this stage here. which is based on the evidence that there is. So they'll be looking at all the written evidence. They'll have the EP report at that point, and often lots of the EP report will be moved into the draft plan. Final stage is consulting and finalising. So then you're talking about what, if you want a different school, you'd be having those kind of discussions. The plan would be given to the school, and the school can say, yeah, we think we can do that, or yeah, we don't think we can do that. Because schools are allowed to say, this is too high a level of need for us, we can't do this. And then at the end, a final plan would be issued, and that would name a school, or sometimes if it's more IOTAS, then they might not name it. And I just think there are a few key points to take away, because parents often don't know this when they're at the beginning of the process. One is the difference between policy and the law. So a local authority might turn down your request for an assessment because their policy says you have to have a certain number of planned reviews, or it needs to be for academic need. But the law says if your child may have special educational needs, or if they might need additional provision in the form of an education, health and care plan, it says if both of these are true, then legally the local authority has to assess them. So that's for you to know, because you can appeal against the decision if they make a decision based on a policy and you want them to change that decision. The other thing that is important to know is that if the school says no, or you can make the application yourself. If they're saying that they don't meet the criteria, but you think they do, or you know that you need something else, then you can make the application yourself. And I guess it's worth saying the local authority and the school can't say yes to everyone. The money has to be spread between all the children that need it, and that's why they're doing that. And if your child can get through without one, then that is the preferred option. Sometimes schools will even direct parents to apply themselves, because sometimes, depending on the local authority, parental requests might be more likely to be accepted. So there's this kind of, sometimes we call it like the back door. It's a sneaky side route. If the front door is being shut in your face, you can make the request yourself. If the school aren't hearing the problems and they're saying we've got another child whose needs are higher and we're going to do that one first, then you can do it yourself. And the school will still be asked to contribute evidence. Okay, so I think it's just the current context. There is an unprecedented level of demand, and the support that schools receive from local authorities has declined. So there's a lack of those kind of lower level support services, which, you know, I'm sure you are experiencing. The SEN system is backed up. There are long waiting lists for CAMS, whether it's for therapy or a diagnostic assessment. So it's a grueling process. I'm going to talk a bit about the challenges just in relation to PANDAS, and the kind of how trying to get the right support in school can be really tough. And when one thing goes right, something else can fall apart. And then there's another transition, maybe a staff member leaves and it throws your child off, and the kind of long-term process of trying to get things in place. And parents often ask about the letters EHCP. It kind of implies that all the letters have equal value: education, health and care, but it is a plan that's essentially funded and led by education. The legal challenges and tribunals are via education, and it can be really hard work getting health and education to talk. And so with PANDAS, we've got a health need leading to the special educational needs. So everything does need to be in the education section, because that's the part that is legally enforceable. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A, because I know there's a special webinar about the legal part of that. So the first thing I want to talk about is having a sense of what your child needs and what might be possible. Parents sometimes say to me that it's the professional's job to decide what their child needs. They don't know what their child needs educationally, but parents usually know more than they think they do. The range of outcomes on an EHC plan is massive. It is quite inequitable, and part of that inequality is sometimes how much parents know their rights, and also how much they know what's available and what's possible to suggest. And one parent said to me she decided her role was to project manage the EHCP process. She said at first she'd expected the caseworker to hold her hand and support her through the process, but she kind of realised it wasn't their job. And she expected someone to explain the process and help her make the decisions, but they didn't. And in the end, she went to the local SEN parent group. They had tea biscuits and someone talked about something which wasn't actually relevant to her, but she met some parents who were also going through the process. She met a local EP, so she was able to find out a little bit from them about how they viewed PANDAS. The EP had never heard of it, but it meant they went and found out about it. And one of the other parents mentioned a local school to her she hadn't heard of, so she went to visit that. She went to visit a few others. So she had this big file of all the paperwork because she decided to project manage, and she kept all the legal timelines in her diary. And she also decided to call her caseworker weekly because she said it helped her to feel in control and on top of it all, even if she couldn't do anything else to help move things forward. One problem that you might encounter as you're going into schools or talking to other professionals about PANDAS is that they won't have encountered it before. So first you might have to explain, but also they're going to relate what they see to the knowledge they already have. And we all do that. So you might think your child, they might think your child has autism or ADHD because those are the most familiar pathways and the most commonly diagnosed conditions in the UK right now. You might think they're missing the bigger picture, that there's more going on. And I think that can be really tiring and isolating because no one knows what it is and you're constantly having to explain it to others. Because PANDAS doesn't present, it doesn't look like your typical special educational need. Maybe the skills can regress and change. It's confusing for teachers and it's confusing for anyone doing a one-off assessment as say for an education, health and care plan. And I'm going to tell you a story about Kelly, who has PANS, and she saw the educational psychologist as part of the EHCP process. She did half a cognitive test with her on Monday, and then she did half the week after because she was so tired after that first bit of testing. But in the second week, she was finding it much, much harder to concentrate. She just kept fidgeting. She was experiencing a flare, but that wasn't kind of noticed and recognised until later. But her test scores in the 2 weeks were really different, and they dropped massively. But no one said anything to the EP about PANDAS. She was quite confused, but she went with the information that she had. And that meant that Kelly's academic ability was underestimated. And the test was suggesting she had a lower ability than she did. And then it affected some of the decisions made about her schooling and support. So when I do a test with most children, I am expecting the results to come out similarly this Monday or next Monday. And a test might assess something like working memory or spatial ability or word recognition. But when children with PANDAS are tested a few weeks apart, it might be very different depending on what they're experiencing. So I think it's really worth highlighting the changeable nature of the condition and how that might impact on someone that's only seeing the child once, saying that to professionals so they can do whatever they can to mitigate for them. And I wouldn't try and say, I wouldn't try and direct them. I would just give them the information. Are you aware that? Have you seen this? Would you mind reading this? So they can make their own decisions about what to do. You might be finding it hard to get people to see what your child is struggling with because it's unseen. And dramatic, visible things like really challenging behaviour often draw people's attention and they become the focus, so other things might be missed. One child I heard about was having seizures at school, and when this happened the first few times, they got an ambulance. There was a lot of attention and worry, and the school focused on putting the safety plans in place, making sure all of that was taken care of. But because they were focused on managing all of that, they didn't really notice some of the other changes which had also happened. Like he was really struggling with understanding, he was struggling to find words, and he didn't want anyone to notice either. So he didn't really tell anyone, but he began to become extremely anxious about himself, and that developed into a bigger problem. And because PANDAS is across multiple domains, so it affects a child in lots of different areas, it can be really hard to connect those dots. And then it can be hard to see the impact because often what we're talking about in school is how it impacts. If a child's struggling with sleep, it has a massive impact on school the next day, but it is kind of invisible because the teacher might not know, and it might look like something else. It might look like bad behavior. They might be hitting. And things like not being able to remember things is really stressful for a child trying hard to be independent, and he used to be more independent before. It can easily end up that the parent can feel blamed, or when a child's ability varies from day to day, teachers can misunderstand this. They might think they're being lazy. It's kind of the most obvious thought is that, oh, you could do this yesterday, you can't do this today. You're not trying hard enough. So if your child's got multiple diagnoses, it needs a really thoughtful approach to work out what they need. And with this kind of condition of the brain, when you can't see what's happening and what they're struggling with, it can affect their social interaction, their emotions, their cognitions, how they're thinking and how they're able to process language, and their physical skills. So it's hard to see they're connected, and it can be unpredictable because of the changing patterns. They might come and go. So we had a few questions about this, and parents have said to me that they're worried about how their diagnoses will be viewed. And you might be in a position where your child has multiple diagnoses. You might not have a PANDAS diagnosis. You might have a diagnosis with a non-preferred term. Lots of different terms are used. You might have multiple diagnoses and a PANDAS diagnosis, and now maybe you feel the other diagnoses are superfluous, but they're kind of still there. And I guess from my perspective, EPs are really used to handling complexity. Multiple diagnosis is common. And we're also used to learning about medical conditions that we haven't come across before. So we don't expect to know it all. We do expect to go and do some research. And if you have a view on those things, if you do think, no, I don't think they have these prior diagnoses, I think it can all be explained by PANDAS, you can say that to them. You can write it in section A, and you can tell them which things you think actually describe your child best. Sometimes parents are worried that the local authority won't look at private medical reports. They do have to look at them. They don't have to agree with it all, because different doctors do sometimes agree, different educationals disagree, sometimes different educational psychologists can disagree, but they will read it and think about it. Sometimes parents are really concerned about having the language that they want in the final report, in the EHCP, for example, or in the EdPsych report, and having the specific words. I wouldn't get distracted about, and that might be difficult example if the local authority isn't yet in a position where it recognizes it. They might have a policy that says, we don't include conditions that are not yet medical diagnoses, for example. But I wouldn't get distracted by a fight about whether they will write those words in their report. In a way, those issues are actually outside an educational psychologist's expertise. It's a medical thing. And you don't actually need to agree on everything to get the right support and to get a useful EHCP. So in this kind of situation, we're trying to think about your child as an individual at this point in time, rather than the diagnosis. We don't need to know all the answers in order to be able to help. And I do think it's really important. There's a decision-making process and the strategies are individualized. It's often how things interact which make the situation really difficult for a child. If they're finding the sensory demands of the classroom difficult, the noise, the hustle and bustle, and they're finding breaking a task down difficult, then when they have to do both those things at the same time, they might have a meltdown because it's all too much. And that can be really confusing for the teacher on the ground. And that's when it's really useful. Then there's an outside person who can put those things together and help them make a bit more sense of it. Okay. Okay, I'm going to move on to thinking about tips to help. And I'm going to think about kind of 4 bits here. I'm going to think about ways of keeping records, gathering evidence, ways to encourage communication between health and education. And I'm going to think a bit about emotional well-being, and I can't remember what the last one is. I haven't written it there. It'll come up. So meetings with professionals. There are more meetings through the process, but it is much easier to get your voice heard at this stage when you're talking to them than nearer the end. It's harder if you get that plan that you don't like, or they've written their report and then try and change it. So it really helps if you know the job role of the person that you're talking to, you know kind of what they do and what their expertise is. And it helps if you have an idea of the kind of things that they might ask, so you can think about it. It's really tough to be put on the spot in a meeting and then that's it, and you might have a thing, or later you might think of it. So if you can think a bit in advance, it helps. It's fine to contact someone like the educational psychologist before they do the assessment and say, we're thinking they might have this. It's not very well known. Would you mind looking at this before you assess them? I wouldn't ever tell them what to do, but it's fine to contact them in advance and say, I'm a bit worried about this, or did you know? You know, could you be aware that if you do it on, if you did it in a different day, then you might get something different. It's fine to say that kind of thing, because their needs are going to be written on the evidence, and that comes from the professionals' reports and from what you say. So you get a section that you write yourself. And professionals going to write their opinion from what they see through tests or observations and through gathering information from you and the school. So these meetings are really good opportunities to make your voice heard. And we've talked about thinking beforehand and what you might want to be prioritised. It really helps to go to those meetings with ideas and things you've thought about, because then your views will go into those reports and it makes them stronger, it makes them more relevant. Sometimes parents feel reticent about doing that. They feel that they're talking to the expert, they should know, let them make their suggestions. And they will bring their ideas and professional experience. But the more you can contribute, the more your report is likely to reflect what's going on the ground and what your child needs. So what the EP writes in their final report is really important for the final document. And it's worth knowing, again, I feel like I've said this a lot already, it's much easier to address the concerns earlier in the process. Talk to them about any concerns before they submit their report. Often they will send you a draft, but they are writing their report on a 6-week legal deadline. So if there isn't time for like sending you a draft and commenting, that deadline is why. So that's always quite tricky. But I would definitely address anything that you're concerned about in their report as soon as possible. Certainly inaccuracies, but if there's something you're like, oh, I don't think that's the right thing, could you put this? It's worth having a conversation with them. They want to work with you. They want you to be happy with the report. They want it to be useful. And in most circumstances, what they write will become the bulk of the plan. So it's really important. If you are near the end of the process and you feel you aren't being heard, often you can add information to section A. So you could send that to your caseworker and say, can we add this to this? Because you can write what you want to write there. Okay. So the next one. So I'm going to talk a little bit about records and gathering evidence. Because EHCPs are based on the evidence that's there, and the strongest evidence tends to be written. And these are some ideas of ways to process and present some of the information for yourself, for school, and for the professionals doing the assessments. You don't need them all. Pick the ones that kind of best fit your situation and what you might need to show. So it's about thinking and being really clear as far as is possible about what your child is struggling with at school and at home. And that might all be in your head. And once you start to write it down and try and make it clearer, it can be quite a helpful way for you as well as people working with your child. And where are we? Let's do the next one. So I'm going to talk about the 1-page profile. And this is a profile of a 10-year-old girl. And it's a really quick way for staff to see what she's struggling with and what helps. It's quite a common type of document schools might well have. And you can make a few edits to make it more appropriate for PANDAS, like you can add a baseline here. Her baseline is recorded so staff can see that at a glance. And it's just got things that, oops, sorry, let's go back. Things I find hard on a good day, on a bad day. A simplest thing of things they like, things that you know work for them at school. And then here, what to do if, and then you can put in the most challenging thing that might happen and things that help if that were to happen at school. And this is something that the Senko at your child's school is probably familiar with, but it's helpful for a professional like an EP to see as well. It contains a lot of information. And if you're not quite sure where to start, if you were doing something like this, you could ask to meet with school to do it with them. You could also do something like setting aside some time yourself to sit on your own and think about what your child is finding difficult and write it down. And it's worth getting a bit of space because it can be quite hard to be honest about the difficulties at home and at school. You might want to talk to some other people who know them really well, ask them what they think. And it can be painful to be writing down things that they're finding hard now that they used to be able to do, for example, but it will really help enhance the information and the understanding of what your child needs. And I would definitely make sure you allow yourself some time afterwards, if you do that, to kind of decompress from it and to take care of yourself. One of the other things I sometimes suggest is chronologies. Just simple. It doesn't need to be long and detailed, just to help explain and help other people understand the story. This little girl was 6 when, after no previous difficulty, she started to have some incidents of really difficult behaviour, and things which had been easy before were difficult. She found it hard to wear clothes. She was having toileting accidents. She was having paranoid thoughts. And this is a really condensed form of her story. It's really just the highlights. But it's quite helpful to have that down for everyone to see. It's kind of brief, just factual information, which is very easily accessible. Then you know that the people reading will have that key information. It just helps to simplify a really complex story. You don't have to do all these. I know it might feel a little overwhelming, but I think sometimes it also helps parents feel in control. And this one, a parent I worked with recently had done this. And they were extremely organized. But what it shows for me and for anyone else looking is how hard and long they've been trying to make it work and how much effort they've been putting in. This is just, a little highlight of it, but there were like pages of with dates and what happened and what they did. So it's otherwise, sometimes if you don't have any kind of written information, it can be just according to your memory at the end. And actually, we really quickly forget. And the amount of work that people are putting in, responding, emailing, phone calls, going on courses, managing things, managing letters from attendants, I think it's quite helpful for parents themselves to look, whoa, how much we're doing. And it's helpful for professionals to be reminded of how much work and effort it is as well. And what this does is makes it more concrete and more real, because it's rather than your just vague recollection of like, oh, I think attendance contacted us then, I think this really difficult thing happened then you know what happened. It doesn't have to be onerous. It is brief, but it's something you might consider, or even consider doing for a short while, and see if you like it or if it's helpful. Something else to think about is ways to encourage communication between education and health, which doesn't often happen automatically, because they have a lot to learn from each other, and you just try and help school understand that this is a health need. The more they can hear from the medics directly about that, then that's going to help when they're understanding. So you could be encouraging information exchange between home and school as well. School can write a letter to the GP talking about what they're seeing before, now, during a flare. It can also help with getting a flexible approach to attendance. You might be able to get the GP or paediatrician to write, talking to school about how they're managing that so that it doesn't escalate to a point where they might be threatening you. And we want them to be able to prioritise health and see the behaviour as health needs. There is a sample letter on the website, I believe, that school can send to a doctor. And for support around things like making reintegration plans after a period off ill, or making plans to maintain connection with school if your child is off ill, like a virtual connection or just phone calls. And the kind of things that school can do if they're planning with putting health first and aware that health is fluctuating, like planning extra breaks or having shorter days or doing a shorter week or going to the favourite lessons, if going in is getting harder and harder. Okay. In terms of encouraging school to record things and to record observations, it can be helpful to have a home school book. It can be helpful to have regular meetings, or at least maybe a regular phone call that's scheduled. There is a checklist, I believe, that goes across the domains that they can look at, which you'll find on the website. And it really helps the medics as well to have that information from school, because they're seeing that your child's such a lot. I also recommend keeping minutes about meetings, because it's just helpful to know what was agreed and when it happened and what if school aren't doing that. And it doesn't need to be extensive or like, obvious and for everyone. You can keep it for yourself in the meeting, a notebook, what happened, what was said, what was agreed. So that there's a date and you know it. And then you can, at the next meeting, if that's not happening, if school aren't doing that part for you, you can be like, okay, so how did this go? Has that happened? Because sometimes just getting things to happen can be quite hard. Okay, let's see. So I also recommend planning for flexibility. And one way to do this is to think about visualizing your child's day, thinking through the bits that they find difficult, thinking through the crunch points, and thinking that through for yourself and writing it down so you can gradually build up a picture of maybe when the challenges happen and what your child's needs are. Again, this is something that you could do with the teacher. It doesn't have to all be on you. It's just an idea, because you could think about that on a bad day and on a good day. And you might be able to even do it just at home and think about how that might apply in school. I think it's helpful for school to know to just expect a child's ability to vary emotionally and cognitively, that to be part of their expectation. And they need to plan for staffing to meet the highest level of need, what your child might need. So there might be plans for a one-to-one setup, a small group setup, outside the classroom setup. It can be really hard for them to do this in practice. And there might need to be a plan for time out of the classroom, a calm space and classroom breaks, a consistent adult, and building activities they enjoy into the time they're in school can be really helpful. If school can be flexible about that and allow it to be a little bit more different in the classroom or off timetable, then that can help. Okay, so I've talked a bit about preparing for meetings, ways of providing information and evidence, record keeping, and encouraging communication. Just a little time check. Okay, what have we got? I've got, just a plan to show you with some language on. And I'm going to also just talk a little bit about the way that we talk about children's difficulties. And then I think we'll be ready for the Q&A. Okay, so this is a way of thinking about how we are talking about difficulties. And at the moment, you might be in this red box. People might be saying these kind of things about your child. They might be saying they're lazy, they're very clingy, they get upset over nothing, they're not really making enough effort. It's because of the parenting, you might just feel that's an undercurrent, that they're disruptive. And this isn't healthy for you or them. In the blue box here, there are medical diagnoses, and sometimes those diagnoses can feel like a way out of the red box. It takes the blame off the child, and diagnoses are labels we use to help us understand what's going on. It's hard to capture the full picture because often under one diagnosis is a really wide spectrum of needs and difficulties. Sometimes parents ask me, where does one diagnosis end and the other start? Or is this due to the autism or the OCD? But in this situation, and I think in particular in the complexity of having PANDAS, it really helps to think of the descriptive labels of what's challenging and what they're struggling with. And you might need to do that in terms of when things are at their best and when things are at their worst. Thinking about labels like finds it hard to start tasks, finds it hard to understand verbal instructions, can be very black and white in their thinking. And kind of the process of doing an EHCP, we're trying to get to those kind of clear descriptive terms of what the struggles are. They don't like large groups because problem solving tends to come best from the green box. There's a kind of sense of curiosity about what's going on. It avoids blaming anyone, and it doesn't get into the why, which might be difficult to unpick and is always hard with lots of diagnoses as well. But it looks pragmatically at the issues, which means you can start to think about what to do to help, even if it's not so clear what the diagnoses are. I'm going to give you a quick, so this is, parents often say they're worried about the language in an EHCP and wonder how things should be written. So this is an example of how the language could be. We're looking again for that kind of descriptive language, which is clear and specific. And this is not kind of any kind of gold standard. It's just to give you an example of what provision could be written and how it could be approached. We want it to be explicit and to write about the impact which things have. So how things come together. And I'm just going to leave that there for you to have a little look through. And if that maybe applies to you, you can have a screenshot or something. So this is Alicia, she's 13, and I've just picked a few of the needs detailed on her EHCP, and she's got multiple diagnoses of ASD, Tourette's, OCD, and dyspraxia. It's been a really long journey. And there isn't a member of staff who knows her well, her teachers don't know her history, she's in a new school, so she's starting to not want to go. So that's when her parents thought the process might be helpful in thinking about something more bespoke for her. Okay, so the last bit I want to cover is just what if school is really not working? And what are the options in that situation? I think the one option is to try and build in as much flexibility you can into an EHCP, reduce timetable, shorter school day, flexi schooling. All of those things can be tricky to agree, but can be, if you're not ready, if you don't feel that you're in the place where you need those or you can't make that work in your situation, school can do those things. It helps if you can be proactive to try and think about it in advance, but that can be hard to do. But where are we? Okay. Yeah, so you might also be thinking, even a shorter school day, even a reduced timetable, I just don't see this working. So some parents decide to cut their losses. And if that's the case, you might need to take a different path altogether. So 𝘰𝘢𝘳𝘬𝘪𝘯𝘊 is education other than at school, and that is still under the local authority umbrella. It is still part of the process, the EHCP process. It's something that you would go for, it's like an individualized package for your child. It might have different things in it. It can be highly flexible, but there's a lot of onus on the parent. Originally, it was intended for really unusual situations and hardly used, but it's become a much bigger thing, in the past few years. And it's usually provided by personal budget arrangement, which means money is delegated to the parent, maybe through an organisation, and it can be a package of different things. Yeah. Elective home education means you are no longer under the auspices of the local authority. So you don't need an education, health and care plan to do this. And you would be deregistering your child. But it doesn't have any money attached. So the advantage of 𝘰𝘢𝘳𝘬𝘪𝘯𝘊 is there's finance there, funding a package. But in elective home education, you don't have to have the same kind of level of contact with the local authority. You wouldn't have annual reviews. You're taking on the responsibility for your child's education, both in cost and in content. So there's a bit more freedom in that option.